Hello CBC Youth and anyone else who is watching, and welcome back to another questions video. This is our series where once a month we take a question about Christianity and Christian culture and we take time to answer it, hopefully thoughtfully and biblically. And so this time we are talking about deconstructionism. And I want to give a brief kind of disclaimer that this is probably going to be called What is Deconstructionism? Deconstructionism is a massive topic with so many hours of testimony and videos and people talking about it. I've watched a lot, I hope, but there are, if you go on this very platform and you just look it up, there are hundreds upon hundreds upon hundreds of hours of testimony of people talking about it, people preaching about it, people doing seminars and stuff. And so I'm not going to be able to cover deconstructionism as widely as some of you might be hoping, and I might not be able to answer every single question about it, but we're going to try and tackle some of it today. So we're talking about what is deconstructionism. And I want to go through this kind of in 4 parts. I want to talk about the definition of deconstructionism, how we can define it. I want to talk about the cycle of deconstructionism, what it might look like, and what, after watching hours upon hours of testimonies and videos and stuff, I feel like I can identify how it kind of happens. Then we're going to talk about helping people who are considering deconstruction. And lastly, we're going to talk about defending ourselves against deconstruction. If you're hearing all of this and you're getting freaked out that you might start deconstructing, I want to help you to put up some guardrails if that really is what you're worried about. So let's get right into it. First, we're going to talk about defining deconstructionism. And broad scale, when we refer to deconstructionism now, deconstructionism is a cultural movement within Christianity in which a lot of believers are leaving the faith. But to actually define what deconstruction is kind of difficult, because deconstruction comes from a postmodern philosopher who himself refused to ever give a definition, as a lot of philosophers will do. And so he himself refused to give a definition. So I've got a couple ones that I've kind of put together. I've got a short one, a long one, a couple other ones more specific to Christianity. So first, our simple definition of deconstruction is it is a critical dismantling of tradition and traditional modes of thought. What is it when we deconstruct? Well, we dismantle some form of thought that we've been taught. So deconstruction, in that sense of the word, can be very broad. It could be any traditional thought you've been given. Now let's hone it in a little bit. This is a slightly longer one, and this is Christian deconstructionism. Deconstruction is a critical dismantling of a person's understanding of what it means to be an evangelical Christian, and in some cases a refusal to recognize as authorities those perceived as occupying privileged evangelical institutional positions who supposedly speak for God. So in our longer definition, we also add in the understanding that people who deconstruct don't just break down the traditional thoughts, they also break down the traditional standards. Right? So if you're deconstructing, you're probably not going to trust a pastor as much as someone who's not deconstructing. And that's fair enough, because a very big part of deconstructionism is believing that nobody is able to actually know something. Again, the guy who came up with it, it was a literary device, and he would say, well, we can never actually know what the author meant because we're not with the author. And so his entire stance was, you can't tell me what someone means because you can't know it. And talking to Pastor Sam about this yesterday, he kind of chuckled and was like, well, then why would he tell people that he knows that if we can never know what he meant, so it kind of eats its own tail a little bit, right? But that's a big part of deconstruction, is you can never know something for sure, so why would you tell me it like you know it for sure? And this lack of trust in traditional thinking tends to also go onto the Bible as well. So you're not going to find very many deconstructioners who are going to have much, if any, respect for the Bible. The Bible is one of the first things to go in deconstruction. In fact, Elisa Childers, who wrote a book on deconstruction, defines deconstruction as a process of rethinking your faith, but not regarding Scripture as a standard. So deconstruction is taking all these ideas about your faith, do I really believe this, do I really believe this, and then taking out of the picture Scripture. So you're not rebuilding your faith in any sort of way, you're actually taking away one of the pillars of your faith and then reassessing your faith without that pillar. So it's a very tricky thing to do. It's very tricky to have these conversations because we tend to lean on the Bible to have these conversations, and it is very quickly removed from deconstruction. And here's my last definition for you. This I just thought was a pretty good, simple kind of modern vernacular definition of it. This is from Mike Winger. He says, deconstruction is about destroying the restrictions and requirements of any kind of religious stuff so that I can create my own new thing. It might be atheism, and it might be hopeful agnosticism. So there's a couple definitions of deconstruction for you. What you really need to know is that it is rethinking your faith without regard for the Bible and hopefully shedding kind of the shackles of religion. A lot of the people who deconstruct, they're looking to get out of religion either way, right? So now let's talk about kind of the cycle of it. And before talking about the cycle of it, again, I want to reinforce, I did watch a lot of people's testimonies for this, but I also want to reinforce that these are people. So we really can't summarize deconstruction super easily because it's really not going to look the exact same for a lot of people. I try to reference a lot of testimonies in here. I try to break it down to its core components, and I feel after watching a lot of testimony that this is fair to them, but I also hope that we understand that we can't really just put every single one of their stories in a box and have it make perfect sense in that way, right? But again, I want to give kind of a what it looks like. What does it look like to deconstruct? So here's a cycle for you. Step one of the cycle would be that the person is generally raised in the church, and by raised I mean literally grown up in the church, and they're never shown any alternative opinions or anything. Might be described as sheltered, right? A lot of the videos I watched had the phrase, I was in such and such church from the day I was born. I heard a bunch of people use that exact phrase. I was in this church, this type of church, from the day I was born. That is usually the start of their story. They usually were in the church from day one, right away, right? One testimony I watched referred to Christianity as a cultural status, more of a cultural status than an actual worldview, meaning that it didn't really affect how they saw the world as much as it just affected where they were positioned in the world. They felt like they were born into the Christian culture. They never really took it on. Another testimony cited that they didn't even know what unbelievers did, what people outside the church did, like in their day-to-day lives at all, before being a teenager, right? He didn't know a single unbeliever. He talked about being homeschooled, and so he only ever knew other Christians who were also homeschooled. He didn't know a single unbeliever. He didn't even know what they looked like until he was a teenager, right? So the process starts with a faith that is either cultural, which means it's coming from the environment they were born into, traditional, which means it is kind of their parents' faith, right? It's passed on to them, or abstract, where it can be very emotions-based, right? It can kind of come from your Sunday school starts and never go much further than that. And this is where I want to be. I want to be hopefully kind to them because it seems like a decent amount of them didn't ever own their faith. And that's me talking pastorally and trying to teach you as students. It seems like a lot of people who deconstruct never had a fully blossoming faith where they loved Christ and knew Christ. I can't say that with certainty for a lot of the people because they do in their stories talk about enjoying the church and enjoying Christ and feeling committed to him. But seemingly their roots weren't very deep, okay? So that's stage one. You're born in the church and you never really have deep-rooted life in the church. Second, the person is introduced to a blind spot in their understanding of their faith. They're introduced to something that they haven't thought about before, or that they haven't tried to find answers for within the Bible before. Here is where I watched the most testimonies, and this is where the testimonies varied the most. Rhett McLaughlin from Rhett and Link, he shared that he shared in his testimony that evolution was really kind of the starting point for his deconstruction, right? Just the topic of evolution, the topic of why is religion against science and science against religion, that really set him off. Link Neal, the other part of Rhett and Link, talks about how his insecurity in his faith started his deconstruction, right? He was just afraid that he wasn't doing enough for God, and eventually that, combined with his friend also deconstructing, ate away at him over time and really, really undercut him. Michael Gungor from the band Gungor embraced the merit of all religions in his deconstruction. He recently said something like Christ is in the Bible, but he's also in Buddha, and he's also and he listed all the world religions. So he embraced that maybe all religions are right, and that's how he went about his deconstruction. Lisa Gungor, his wife, shared that it was a time of great suffering that kind of made her question if God is actually good, and then she came around to maybe I don't believe in God at all through that time of suffering and trial and seeing suffering in the world, not just her own suffering. Christy Burke, a pretty well-known atheist on YouTube and TikTok, shares that the doctrine of election really started her deconstruction. Someone in a different church that she knew introduced her to the doctrine of election, and she couldn't really reconcile that with her understanding of God up to that point and her view of God. Trent Thompson, another YouTuber, lists that original sin and hell are the things that started his deconstruction. He just kind of openly disagreed with those in his video. It wasn't much of a slippery slope for him. And again, there are a bunch of other examples. A lot of times people will talk about the reliability of the Bible. Sometimes people will say that the gospel doesn't make sense, or that the gospel is foolish, or that they're not a sinner, or that Jesus didn't have to die for their sins, or that God was an unjust parent, doing parental abuse on Jesus. And then some people will just say there's just zero evidence that God exists, right? So that's our second step in this cycle, is that they have some blind spot that their eyes are opened to through some other source, right? That's where the questioning really starts. Third, the process is accelerated by the person receiving unsatisfactory answers to their questions. A lot of these people were very faithful with their questioning in that they took it to other believers, church leadership, all that stuff. And they happened to just be in churches where they were kind of shut down. They didn't receive any answers that were satisfying to their questions. Dave Stovall, a musician, he talks about being raised in a really legalistic church that would take really hardline stances on their interpretation of the end times and on one person's ability to drink at all, not just get drunk, but drink at all, and then they wouldn't explain it. And when he questioned them on it, they wouldn't explain it. And that was really frustrating for him. Rhett McLaughlin, again, he was really deeply troubled that people in his church would not have a conversation with him about evolution versus creationism, because he felt that evolution was irrefutably proven, and he thought that Christians were just really naive for ever denying it. And so he got frustrated. He became really frustrated with the church. And so the questions that either don't get answered or don't satisfyingly get answered lead to the fourth step, which is the person seeks answers to the questions elsewhere, right? So they've been raised in the church and never shown any other option. They've been introduced to a blind spot. They've asked questions that haven't been answered well from their church, and now they're starting to look elsewhere. So this can start with science. If you have the people who are more intellectual and it is something like creation that kind of starts their tipping point, science can be where they look first. Philosophy, for a lot of people will look to philosophy. a more progressive church. A lot of people will go to progressivism and they'll say, well, especially someone who is fed up with like social justice issues within the church, they'll end up in a progressive church because they'll be able to say, this church looks more like the culture around me and still lets me have the feeling of church. So a lot of people end up going more progressive in their deconstruction. Some people will look to postmodernism, which is basically just agnosticism, like we can't know anything for certain, and so stop trying to tell me you know these things for certain. Some people look to other religions, as the Gungers did, and some people will even just kind of look internally to their own emotions, like, do I feel like there's a God? Do I feel like these things are true? And they'll find answers elsewhere. And then the last step in this cycle is that the person's faith becomes muddied and confused, and they deconstruct. And they deconstruct more and more issues, right? They toss that first issue aside. They say, well, the church was wrong in their opinion about that thing. What else are they wrong about? And they just start taking stuff out left and right. And people who deconstruct, again, this is a generality. I'm not trying to say that every single deconstructioner does this, but people who deconstruct tend to end up with some level of hostility towards Christianity, where they don't like Christians, and they might lash out at aspects of Christianity. And people refer to this stage of it as just the deconversion. They are not a Christian anymore. Whether they're still truly saved or not, that's a debate that you can have. I even have a video on that. But they're not a Christian at the time, not in title, right? And again, that hostility is for a lot of these people because of hurt that they experienced during the process. A lot of these people, they brought up questions. They felt like their questions made them a danger to the church. They felt isolated, pushed out. And so then they don't want anything to do with Christianity. They don't want to be back in a church because they feel like they escaped from a church, right? So what can we do? What can we do to help, right? And understanding the cycle will help, because you might be able to identify where your friend is at in it or where someone else is at in it. So it will help. But what else can we do? How can we be there for them? How can we step in and help them? And so this, I would give you 3 things to kind of use as guide rails. Number 1, I would say support their questions. Support their questions. Deconstruction for most people, again, there were people I encountered that they genuinely didn't have questions. It just seemed like they were never really a believer at all. But for most people, deconstruction starts with questions. And it ends with answers, whether they get those answers from the church and return to the church, or whether they get those answers from an outside source and start to distrust the church. So it starts with questions, and it grows more and more volatile as their questions are not supported. So if this is a friend of yours who's deconstructing, or a family member who's deconstructing, the best thing you can do is to stick with them, to stay beside them, to support them in their questioning, to help them find answers to their questions, maybe even to challenge the answers they find elsewhere to their questions, and just to stay the course, stay with them, be by their side. And I know that this is going to be really scary. None of us as believers want to hear a friend or a family member or anything start to take shots at the church and to throw out questions that we feel like we can't answer, right? But the best thing you can do for this person is to stay steadfast and to stay by their side and to show them that they're not a danger to the church. Their questions are not isolating them because you're staying right by them, right? It'll help them feel safe. It'll help them feel heard. And maybe you can help them even to find satisfying answers within the church so that they don't even reach the point of kind of going outside the church. This is 1 Peter 3:15. It says, "But in your hearts honor Christ the Lord as holy, always being prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you. Yet do it with gentleness and respect." So stick through with their questioning, be gentle, be kind, be respectful to them. And again, poke them and prod them. The answers that they find, maybe question those, right? Help them in the process of thinking it through. The next thing you can do is just to treat them like a person. And I hope I am doing this with this video because I do want to be respectful to them. Because after watching so many of their testimonies, deconstruction is a really, really painful thing for these people. It is incredibly painful. We will see the deconstructioners, a lot of times we'll see them at the end of their story, where they're probably proud that they deconstructed, and they're probably trying to convince other people to deconstruct as well. And we can be frustrated with them in that moment. But we need to remember how agonizing it was for these people to go through this process. They felt like they were isolated in their questioning. They doubted whether they fit in with the church. A lot of them felt like imposters. Link talked about that a lot in his testimony, feeling like an imposter every Sunday at church. Some of them might have been hurt by the church. That might have accelerated their deconstructionism. And a lot of people just felt judged by the church. They felt judged by other church members. So we need to be there for our friends, for our family, even for other strangers that are within the church. We need to be there for them as they deconstruct, because they're going to feel isolated. They're going to feel left out. And honestly, I think the enemy is going to use that to just speed up the process. Right? They're going to feel like, oh, well, clearly I'm too dangerous to be in this church. I need to get out of here because my thinking has reached a higher level or something, right? So we need to be there for them. We need to be there right beside them, supporting them in their questioning, and never treating them like some problem to be dealt with, never treating them like a danger to the church, but treating them with respect and dignity and hoping to see them reconciled to the church. And then the last thing I would say for you is pray. Pray. If you have a friend struggling with deconstruction, if you have a family member struggling with deconstruction, if someone you work with is struggling with deconstruction, whatever it may be, pray. Because I promise you, there will be times where it feels impossible. It feels absolutely impossible to change their mind on whatever topic has started their deconstruction, right? Maybe they're talking about evolution just all the time now. Wow, I can't believe Christians ever deny evolution. They're so dumb. Maybe they're talking about election, right? How could a good God pick and choose who believes in him? Maybe they're talking about social justice issues, how the church has mishandled that. Maybe they're talking about sexual issues. Why can't Christians have sex before marriage? That seems really dumb and restrictive. Whatever it may be. It can feel impossible to change their mind on that, but I promise you this, God can. God can change their mind. God can take their mind and go, boom, you believe something different now. He can. He does it to all of us. That's how any of us are believers at all. And so pray. Pray for your friend. Pray for your family member. Pray for your coworker. Pray for your fellow student. Whoever it is, pray for them. That God would take this time of questioning and turn it on its head so that it, instead of becoming a time of wandering from God, becomes a season where they are closer to God than ever, right? Because there are a lot of deconstruction stories that end on the other side, where they go through, they deconstruct, they feel like they're further from God than they've ever been, and then God grabs them and he brings them back. He gives them true understanding of the Bible. He puts them in a Bible-centered church and they flourish. Elisa Childers has a great story about this. If you ever look into her, she deconstructed into a progressive church, felt very distant from God, felt like they were teaching nonsense and was starting to just look outside the church in general. And then she just turned to the Bible and she came back. Because God grabs people. God grabs minds, God grabs hearts, and he changes them. So rather than just feeling like day in and day out you're burdening yourself by how seemingly unchanging your friend is on whatever topic they're struggling with, pray. Go before the Lord and say, Lord, would you change their mind? Or if they do need to go through this process, would you use this process to bring them back to you? So that's what we can do for people who are deconstructing. What can we do for ourselves? How can we defend against deconstructing? I mean, honestly, watching a lot of these testimonies, it was people my age. That's burdensome. That was tough to watch. So what can we do to defend against it? For this, I have a video on what to do about doubting your faith. And rather than rehashing a lot of it here, I'll point you over to that. Go watch that. If you are doubting your faith and you want to know how to approach that, go watch that. But to give you a shortened version, the takeaway from deconstructionism is not that questions are evil, or that asking questions about Christianity will lead you to leave Christianity. I don't want you to ever think that. Because we should be asking questions all the time, because that's how we learn. So asking questions is not evil. Asking questions does not lead you to leave Christianity. Questions are a worthy strengthener of our faith when we handle them responsibly. They're a tool, and if we use them in the wrong manner, we're going to hurt ourselves. When we handle them responsibly and take them slowly and surely, and we find trusted sources on them, and we pray about them, and we come to God and we ask for His help in them, they are a good strengthener of our faith. And what we can do most to defend against deconstruction is to stand firm in the Bible. In a lot of these testimonies, the first piece to fall was the Bible, right? I believe in evolution now, so clearly the Bible isn't true anymore, right? I believe that hell isn't real, so clearly the Bible isn't true anymore. The Bible was always the first piece to fall that led to these people ultimately leaving the church. Stand firm in the Bible and reject the notion of deconstructionism that there is no absolute truth and that no one can know it and that people are wrong if they say they do. No, there is absolute truth. There are people who know it, praise God, and the Bible is where we find it. Hold fast to that and trust God in that, and you will be defending yourself against deconstructionism. So, like I said, that is a super, super quick overview of it. If you would like some more resources you could watch regarding deconstructionism, please reach out and let me know, because again, I watched a bunch. And I feel like I took in a lot more of deconstructionism than I can put out here in 20 minutes. So please reach out, ask me. I'd be happy to talk to you about it more in person or to give you more resources on it. But I hope this blesses you, encourages you, helps you in dealing with this topic in your life. We'll see you next time.